Welcome, everybody. If you are joining us on Zoom, we're going to ask you to turn your camera off and mute yourself for right now. And if you're joining us on Facebook, we are so glad that you are here and can't wait to see you and to be with you here in this space together. My name is Reverend Allison Lanza. I am one of the pastors at Ridgely Christian Church in Fort Worth. And we are thrilled tonight to welcome to this space, Reverend Robyn Bles. Robyn is one of my dear friends and is a pastor in Des Moines, Iowa at Wakanda Christian Church in the Christian Church Disciples of Christ. And so she is here tonight to help guide us as we think through what grief can teach us about today, what grief can look like today, what grief lessons grief can teach us about what's happening in the world today. So welcome, Robyn. We are so glad you are here.
It's so great to be here. It's so nice to see your face, Allison. Welcome to my back porch in Iowa.
We love it. It's great to see you.
Yeah.
Will you start just by telling those of us who are here who don't know you just a little bit about yourself?
Yeah. So my name's Robyn Bles. I am the senior minister with the amazing folks at Wakanda Christian Church here in Des Moines, Iowa, which as a native Nebraskan, I think Iowa is kind of the greatest place ever. So you're welcome here anytime, particularly when COVID is over and allows traveling. I am the mom to two amazing girls, Millie and Rosie, which you'll be hearing a little bit about tonight. And you will notice I talk with my hands a lot. And so you might notice on my hands, I think maybe I got it all off, but because my youngest Rosie is turning 4 and we had a rainbow birthday party this weekend, we did my greatest skill in life, which is tie-dyeing. So my hands are kind of green. So if you notice that, it's not a disease or anything. It's just my love of tie-dye.
Happy birthday to your sweet one too. That's exciting.
Yes, it is.
Thanks for being here with us. Tonight, we're going to talk about what grief can teach us. All of us have had experiences of grief. If you're alive in this world, you have had an experience of grief. You've lost someone you love. You have lost a relationship. You've lost a dream. Particularly in the last 6 months in the pandemic, many of us have lost a lot. Our country's lost over 200,000 people. We've lost many things we thought would be, what we thought school would look like, what we thought work would look like, what we thought our lives would look like. A lot of grief. But it's not all bad news. Those of us who have experienced grief before, and those of you in this space who have known grief, you know that grief teaches us a lot. It teaches us a lot about ourselves, a lot about our world, a lot about where we find our strength. And so I've really become convinced as a pastor and a person of faith that the lessons we've learned in our personal grief over our lifetimes can help us to heal today as a whole community, as a whole world. So I wanted to bring to you all tonight Pastor Bles, Reverend Robyn, who is phenomenal in many ways, but has had a lot of experience with grief. And well, lots of us have had that. Many of us have had lots of experience with grief and just kind of let it go. Robyn's really learned from it. She's learned how to find healing even in the midst of grief, how to find joy even in the midst of unspeakable grief. And I really think she can be a phenomenal teacher for us in this time of what it looks like. So, Robyn, thank you for being here. And I think some of the people missed the beginning. You have a motion sensor lights. If you see Robyn waving wildly, she's keeping the lights on, being good for the earth.
Yes. Unlike you Texans, or I know we have some Kentuckians, it's September here in Iowa. And so that means we're going to be heading into winter pretty soon. So it's beautiful outside right now. So I'm taking advantage of that. But yes, I have a motion sensor light. So if you see me doing this, I'm just turning the light back on.
I love it.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about what grief has looked like in your life?
Yeah. Well, there are a lot of you on here who are familiar with some of my personal stories of grief. Um, I think it's important first to remember we all have, as you said, Allison, we've all experienced grief. Whether in big ways or small ways. Um, in the moment, whatever our grief is, it feels really big. So I know I personally have experienced some pretty big griefs in my life. Two in particular. It center around well, just the moments of when you don't think what is going to happen actually happens. So my two great sorrows in life center around the same kind of moment. And that was the moment when my first daughter, Millie, had to undergo surgery at 3 days old. She needed to do some minor repairs to her intestine. However, any surgery, no matter how minor, is still surgery. And there was an accident that still baffles the surgeons. And that accident led to Millie enduring cardiac arrest on the surgery table. She was in cardiac arrest for 30 minutes before they were able to restart her heart. And during that time, she suffered a traumatic brain injury because her brain was deprived of oxygen. And so while her intestines, which is what the original surgery was meant to repair, was eventually able to be repaired, and her intestines made a full recovery. Her heart even made a full recovery. However, her brain was not able to make a full recovery. And so that launched my family and I and my community into 14 months of her earthly life, which was full of many doctors, many amazing and compassionate physical therapists and occupational therapists and speech therapists, and two just awesome congregations who loved Millie and our family, and just a community that was even larger than I could ever imagine, just centered around us. Millie passed at 14 months old. And then that led to the second great grief of my life. And that is where we need to learn how to hold our grief. And everyone experiences grief differently. Even within a couple who both have journeyed through the same experience and have been in it together the whole time. And so I also had to endure my beloved husband just utterly self-destructing. And unfortunately, in that self-destruction, myself, our second child, and our life as we know it, at the time, was caught in that destruction. So it has been very painful to live through, to watch, to endure, and to see what pieces were left in the aftermath of that. And so from that one moment on the operating table, in many ways, I lost half of my family. that day. It just took 5 years for it to come to the completion of that life. Yeah, so grief is complicated and messy. Allison, you're muted.
Thank you for sharing your story with us.
It's quote of 2020.
That takes a lot of bravery and vulnerability to share that. We all have experienced grief, but it is sometimes hard to share because we feel all alone in it. And so I think that's one of the lessons grief can teach us, is how to be courageous about sharing our story. And that's one of the things you have done beautifully, is you have found healing for yourself, but also helped the rest of us find healing by sharing Millie's story and your story with us. So thank you for that. And we hold Millie always in our prayers and in our love, and you in that. What an amazing first oldest daughter you have. Just phenomenal, who brought the community together in really incredible ways. So thank you for sharing that. What lessons in all of that, what lessons have you learned from grief? What lessons do you think grief can teach us? And before you jump into that, I forgot to mention at the beginning, if you are watching with us on Zoom or on Facebook or on YouTube, feel free to write questions you have in the chat, and then we'll make sure we can get those to Robyn as well before we finish tonight. But what lessons has grief taught you about how to find healing, how to find wholeness, how to find growth, and what do you think grief can teach all of us?
Yeah.
What does grief teach us?
There are many things. If you know me personally, you know that I'm a very high energy person. I am someone who I'm always I think FOMO, the fear of missing out, was made for me, because I'm always just wanting to know what's happening next, what's the new exciting thing. And so I think for me personally, the greatest lesson that grief has taught me is to slow down. Mary Oliver has this beautiful line that says, things take the time they take. And I have just kind of substituted the word things for grief, and that grief takes the time it takes. And so nothing else slows me down, reminds me to connect deeply with my body and with my spirit and with my surroundings more than grief, and reminds me to kind of take stock and look around, because in my own story, but I think it's true for everyone in grief, grief is the thing that knocks you off balance. And so when you're off balance, you're grasping, you're clinging, you're just trying to find some solid ground. And so when we learn how to live with our grief and how to hold it, we then learn how to center ourselves in what is important. And so we find our grounding no matter what happens when the world gets turned upside down. And so I guess that's the second thing that I've really learned about grief. No one wants to do it. No one wants to do grief work. It's kind of the worst and the hardest, because the reason why you have to do it is because usually the worst and the hardest thing has happened to you. But when you actually do it, you find something more amazing. Allison, I was talking about this with you the other day. I just preached on this past Sunday. in Exodus, I preached on one of the times the 10 Commandments pops up in the story of Exodus. And the very first time Moses is on the mountain, the people are freed, and they're all in a huge jumble of grief because they're like, we just left life as we knew it, even though it was awful, it's what we knew. And now we're out here and we have no idea what's going on. And Moses, you told us to do this and we don't know what to do. And so God gives Moses these 10 commandments, or as Children Worship and Wonder tells us, the 10 best ways of living. And then the people are like, okay, yeah, Moses, you go talk to God because God is really big and scary and we're really hurting. And we're going to stay over here. And you go over there and then tell us. And at the end of that passage, it's Exodus 20:21. It says, Moses drew near to the dark cloud where God dwelled. So as Christians, we talk a lot about how God is the light. And that's true. We don't really spend a lot of time talking about the darkness, other than maybe in Lent and Advent. But most of the time we don't like talking about those things. But right there in that moment, God was in the darkness, and it took Moses being brave and really probably scared to go into that darkness. And so I think that's the thing about grief is God is already in there. God's already in the darkness, already in that grieving. And so when we take our steps in there, we will find God. We won't be alone.
Yeah. I love it. Yeah, I think you're right on. That is what grief teaches us. And those pieces you highlighted teach us to slow down, to pay attention. I loved your talking about grounding. When our whole world shakes and all the things we are used to finding our grounding in, when all of that is lost, we find where our grounding is, what our center is, what holds, even when everything else falls apart, and learn to stand on that. I loved how you talked about when the worst thing happens, we still find that God is there. There's a quote, I think Frederick Buechner, I'm not 100% sure, but an Easter quote, I always hear at Easter that says, the worst thing is never the last thing. Mm-hmm. And when the very worst thing we can possibly imagine happens, it's not the last thing. God is still, even in that very worst.
Yeah.
And in that very worst, that's sometimes God's already present, so we're not alone. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All of us now are in communal grief.
Yes.
In some way or another, our whole country, our whole world is in grief. The world as we knew it has shifted, has changed. What we have always known is no longer holding steady. How do you think these lessons you've learned in personal grief, the lessons all of us can learn when we do that grief work, how can they guide us today? How can they help us find healing as a society, as a community?
Many things. I think first of all, we as pastors, we talk a lot about the stages of grief. We've learned about this. It's almost become a buzzword in our culture of like, I'm in, the stages of grief. I think many of us were in the, I'm just going to eat all of the cookies stage of grief for a while in COVID.
I was in the chips and salsa stage, but I lived in that stage for a long time.
Yeah, I understand. I was, thanks to my time in Kentucky, I was in a lot of bourbon stage. So that might be otherwise known as denial, or bargaining of like, I'm just gonna like eat this thing.
And if you don't know what she's talking about, I feel like most of you do, you wise folks listening, but it's Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's Stages of Grief, if this is something you want to invest and learn more about.
Correct. Yeah, I'm gonna go over them.
Perfect.
So what's important to remember, because while our brains think linearly, that's not the way our bodies and our spirits and even our world work. So yes, famous death and dying guru Elizabeth Kubler-Ross gives us this wisdom of all you need to do to learn about death and dying is spend time with those who are dying, and they will teach you everything you need to know. And so she originally coined these phases on the stages of dying, but also found that they related to also stages of grieving. And so those stages are denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And something I personally love, towards the end of her life, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross also said that she wanted to add a sixth stage, which was angry at God stage, as her sixth stage. And she said, I understand how this is just really an extension of the anger stage, but it feels like it's its own thing.
Mm-hmm. I feel like in the last 6 months, I've hit most of those.
Mm-hmm. I think so. Even the sixth stage, angry at God.
Mm-hmm.
And so I know in those 14 months with Millie, I spent a lot of time in the angry with God stage. Even though I knew that God didn't cause this to happen, God didn't want this to happen. This was not done to test me. This was not done to teach me anything. This just was. I had nowhere else to put all of this anger other than on God. And so I think we can learn right now, no matter what these stages are, where you are in these stages are just what they are, and they are productive. I know it doesn't sound productive to be angry or depressed or bargaining, but they are. They are all productive stages, but don't think of them as like I'm in stage 1 and then I advance to stage 2 and then I advance to stage 3. This is not a video game. This is not leveling up. Other grief specialists have instead talked about them as like a spiral staircase, and that you visit them in their own time. And so I know, particularly right after Millie passed, I felt like I was taking little tiny sips of every single stage, every single hour. And I think that was just because that was all my spirit could handle. And so my brain and my spirit worked together and saying, okay, you can only take this much. And then you're going to take this much. And then you're going to take this much. And so I think first what we need to learn in this time is, as you said, Allison, we're all in a great big group project of grief. And so to give ourselves as individuals grace, and then to give one another grace. Everyone who doesn't want to wear a mask, I feel like, is in some stage of denial. And that's not just them being obstinate. That's no one wants to accept this reality, because this reality is pretty hard. And that's what grief is. And so to give yourself grace and to give one another grace. Were you going to say something, Allison?
Just that's an interesting way to think about a lot of the debates we're having in society around now between people who are really staying cautious and people who are really kind of out on the move, and how some of that might be different stages of denial and acceptance and what's happening, or depression, or it's not that we're against each other. It's just that we're in the different stages at the same time.
Yes. And even, I would even say the bargaining, of like, if I wash my hands, wear all the hand sanitizer, put my mask on, even put a face shield, don't go out, then I'm going to be fine. And my people are going to be fine.
How much more compassion
Um,
that can teach us right now between people who are living life very differently than us. If we don't think they're just against us or they're afraid or they're not taking this seriously, instead we think we're all in different stages of grief and how can we be compassionate towards each other in that. That's a
yes.
really way to share compassion that I think grief can teach us.
Yes. And I also think I really love her sixth stage, even though it's not, science or her proven path. But I personally found that sixth stage of anger at God to be incredibly helpful because when we are grieving at our deepest level, there's so much emotion, and to trust and to believe that God can handle it. Mm-hmm. So that way, I know as I held Millie in my arms and I said some really not nice things to God, things that my mother would probably yell at me for. But being able to give them to God meant I was able to express them, because that's also the thing about grief. They're your feelings. You have to feel them. Yeah. But you also need to feel them in a way that is life-giving. And so give that to God. So then that way I was able to then give all of my patience to Millie.
I love that. And what a powerful gift I think that grief can teach us too is I think pre-pandemic, lots of us weren't really authentic with God or authentic in church, right? We put on our best dressed selves, showed up with our best smiling face, even if everything was falling apart. And that's how we entered faith. That's how we approached God. That's how we approached our faith community. And since then, now, not only by virtue of Zoom and moving things virtual, we now see each other in our t-shirts and our shorts and not our best dress all the time. But I've also heard, just in my faith community, I've heard a lot more prayers spoken out loud that are those authentic, real prayers of where our hearts really are breaking. And I've heard a lot more of those conversations amongst each other of what's really going on underneath, and trusting that not only God, but that our faith community, our siblings in Christ, can hold that with us and know that with us and love that with us. And I think that's something that grief teaches us, that all of our emotions, all of ourselves, all of our brokenness and all of our beauty is all loved and cared for by God and is loved and welcomed in the body of Christ and needed. And I think that's a place that we become open to now, because when we are that, then the body of Christ becomes alive on earth. And when we can be real, then God can really work. I thank you for sharing that. That's an insight I hadn't thought through, and I really like that and appreciate that.
I love that, actually, because so with Millie, her first surgery was done orthoscopically, and that is what caused the accident. And so when she had to have her second surgery, we opted for it to be done, I don't know the full medical term, but the old school way, where they just sliced open her abdomen and did it that way. So the doctors told us she would have this scar, and it was probably about this long, which on a baby's abdomen is over half of her abdomen. And they told me to just massage it with lotion, because many of us know scar tissue is stronger than the original tissue. Mm-hmm. However, it's also more rigid and it's not flexible. Mm-hmm. And so like our bodies know how to heal, but it's not as nimble and adaptable as it was before. Mm-hmm. And so they told me to just massage that tissue, and that would help keep it flexible. And I couldn't help but think of doubting Thomas. And I think poor Thomas gets a bad rap. I don't think he's a doubter. I think he's just really curious.
He really paid attention in worship and wonder. He got that wonder part down.
Oh yeah. Because I didn't want to touch that scar, because that scar on my daughter meant she would never be whole in the way she was born. However, by touching that scar, it also meant that I had to wholly accept her as she was. And I think for me, as her mother, that was one of the hardest parts of my grieving process, because I birthed a baby. And we all know that, you know, life forms and shapes us. But at 3 days old, she dramatically changed, and not of her own choosing. And her life was dramatically altered. And so I had to accept and love and celebrate the baby that I now had after that surgery. And so even by rubbing that scar, I really felt like Thomas, in just, I had to accept the full shock, because shock is a part of grief. I had to accept all of the things that I wanted to change. I had to accept all of the anticipatory grief that was going on in my child's life was not going to be the way I had imagined it. And so when we can even just place our hand upon that wound, or even just turn our eye toward what feels dark and big and scary, that alone is a healing act. And to give ourselves grace and, okay, I've done this today. And that is a really big, powerful step.
That is so powerful. And to think through what that looks like now, that before we can get to the acceptance of what our new world, this world that's creating, will be, and that it's okay, we have to touch the scar that something broke.
Yeah.
And that it will never be the same. And to face the shock of that, and face the hurt of that, and live in the grief of that. And then we eventually, through those stages of grief, can get to the acceptance and love and awe of what this new thing might be, as you came to love Millie's life for what it was and not what you imagined, and what it is and not what you imagined. But that first, we can't just go there. I think a lot of us tried to immediately go to, well, what's the new thing going to be? And not to say, you know, we can't get there until we really grieve what was, and we touch it and we see it, and we're honest and real about what broke.
Yeah.
In lots of places. That's really powerful.
And to give ourselves space that it's still really sad what was lost. And that's always going to be sad. You know, I think of our graduates this last year. And yes, they are so resilient, and there's going to be so much more in their lives than just missing high school graduation or college graduation. However, it's still sad that they missed those things.
Yeah, when we lose people we love and dreams we have always dreamed, that it is okay to always grieve those. And to always be sad about those. And we can still love and accept whatever life comes into being next, while still being really sad that it had to be that way, and that broke and that death happened. That's good insight. Thank you. What do you think the role of the church is right now to help our world as we are grieving now? Church is not just church, faith communities of all types are traditionally pretty good at grief. Yeah. We are aware when the rest of the world tries to deny grief, when everything falls apart, when the loved one dies, when our dreams die, faith is where we show up. So I think as people of faith, we have had more experience talking through this and thinking through this and understanding of liturgies and rituals that help us to heal How do you think the church can help our world heal right now as we're experiencing this grief? What's our role as people of faith?
Well, I don't think our role has ever changed. Because as you said, we're really good at grief. That's oftentimes probably the best thing we do. We know how to show up with flowers, with casseroles, with cards, with our very selves. And so while right now in COVID, all of that looks differently, I know with my church, just in these 6 months, we've had 7 funerals. And every single one of them, because of COVID, has been dramatically different. And that feels, as I've become really good at a Zoom funeral. Mm-hmm. And I never thought I would ever utter those 2 words together, Zoom and funeral. Allison, I know you know what I'm talking about. Mm-hmm. Because it feels so very strange. Mm-hmm. Because the greatest gift is presence, is touch. However, those things don't change, and that is exactly what the church is called to do right now in this time. We do know how to bear witness, and that is David Kessler, who is a student of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, has said, grief needs to be witnessed. Mm-hmm. And I didn't know that to be true, because our griefs are where we're most vulnerable. And so that's not what we want to show the world. That's not what we want to share with the world. And so it feels even scarier to then share it. But luckily, because of the duration of Millie's life, I had this amazing community show up. And they showed up virtually, not just in Lexington, Kentucky, where Millie was born, but there were people literally around the world praying. And I think that's what redeemed Facebook for me, because that was the space. It became the space for all of us to mutually grieve together and to support one another and to champion Millie, and to hold all of us who were just utterly dumbfounded. And I didn't do that. One of my friends put a private Facebook together, and at one time there were over 1,000 people as a part of that. And so I know, my church included, no one likes worshiping the way we are. No one likes being virtual. No one likes being social distanced. However, that is still a powerful light in the midst of so much unknown. And so I think that is exactly what the church is called to do right now. And that's us embracing our own dark, scary place. In church on Sunday, my youth director gave the image to our children from Finding Nemo. That when this little fish Marlin is trying to find his son, and his co-pilot is this super forgetful blue tang fish. And Dory is told, when you get to the trench, I know it's dark and scary, go through it. Don't go above it. Well, Dory forgets, and Marlin sees a big, dark, scary trench and doesn't want to go into it. And so they go above it. And then they have to go through even more hardship of jellyfish. And so I think that is what the church, we already know how to do this. And so it is our time to bear witness of what it means to sit in those virtual pews and hold each other's hands in the darkness, because that is the only way through it.
There's so much power in that, and the idea of thinking that we have to have our grief must be seen, must be witnessed for us to be able to move, to find some healing in the midst of it. I remember when we were at Vanderbilt together, I went on a trip with some other students to Namibia, and there had been great genocide there, and it was horrible. And we went and visited one of the cemeteries, and there were a bunch of graves that were marked with names, but then there was a whole other big unmarked mass grave. And the person who was giving us the tour, I hadn't connected it to this until just now, but the person who was giving us the tour said, yes, when we don't want people to heal, people don't want others to heal, they don't let them remember their grief. They want to hide it and push it away and make them push it away. And that's why we have unmarked graves in times of war and in times of violence, is because they know that when grief is, they didn't say it in this way, but they tried to say is they know when grief is said out loud, when you're allowed to have the name and the place you can go to remember, that's how you find healing. And that's how you shift, when you can go back to remember. When you can't remember, you just keep denying it and living in it. And I think there's so much power to that, and what's happening in our world today too, of how we as a faith communities can be the one to bear witness that this is broken and this is hard. And we want to name that, and that going through that dark tunnel, like Nemo did, that's how Marlon and Dory did. That's how you find that healing. That's how you move to that next place, is by just being honest and real with it.
Yeah.
That's really powerful. And I think that's a great gift the church can offer.
Yeah. When I went to Bosnia with Week of Compassion, and we visited Srebrenica, which is the greatest genocide in Europe since World War II and the Holocaust. And I didn't know what to do with it. I was so anxious. And I think when we look around our world right now, I think everyone is so anxious. And I stood there and I just saw all of these graves, and I'd heard this horrific story, and I turned to our leader, the indomitable Reverend Amy Gopp, and I just said, what do we do? Because I wanted to do something. And I think in our grief, we want to do something. We want to fix it. And she just looked at me and she just said, sometimes all you can do is just sit in it. And at the time, I didn't understand it. I couldn't do it. But I have just heard that over and over and over again, of that is the gift of our grief. That sometimes there is no doing. There's just being in it. And sometimes that's enough, because that alone takes our breath away. And that alone is teaching us a resilience and the power of God's life.
And the gift of our faith is, I think, that when we sit in it, when we slow down, we know that God meets us there. We know that in the story of Jesus. We know that in the story of so many of our biblical ancestors, our spiritual ancestors, that in those hardest moments, God is there fully and working and loving and holding us. And so I think that's a gift that faith can teach us, is that we're not alone in those moments.
Yeah.
That we are found and we are held.
It's found in every tradition as well. I mean, that passage I already mentioned from Exodus, I mean, that's from the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew tradition of God is dwelling in that dark cloud. Rumi, and ancient Muslim poets, just an amazing human, says over and over again, our heart has to keep breaking until it can break open. And so I think that's the other thing about church. We know how to be together. I know as disciples, people are like, oh, you don't we joke because we say we're the gathering place and we're the place of welcome. And sometimes that does mean, we avoid the hard conversations, but that also means we are people who know how to hold the tension, because that is life. That is what life is. And so,
to like come off. I was sitting in the darkness for a while, finding God there in that beauty.
Beautiful. And so we know as church how to bear witness to the complicated, the messy, the unfixable. And so that is, I think the world needs the church now more than ever.
Mm-hmm. I love that. Looking at many of you who are on this, whose names I see on Zoom and on Facebook, I know not all of you, but I know many of your stories, and I know the grief that you have experienced and the losses you have seen and felt. And so I hope you know and have heard said today that you're not alone, that God is with you, and that God is holding you in this. And that the worst thing, even in the worst thing, that's where God will show up and will meet you, and it will not be the last thing. And so I hope you hear that you are loved in this place, and also by God always. If you have questions for Robyn that you want to share, feel free to type them in and we will get those to her to ask. While we're doing that, I thought we might end with some joy. I think this whole thing has been joy, and that we learned that even in our hardest times, that's when God can teach us and heal us. But where are you going for inspiration these days? What's bringing you joy?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, my soon-to-be 4-year-old, Rosie Joe. And I mean, she is so much a part of this grief story as well. So we got pregnant with Rosie right after Millie passed. And I worried so much about her birth, just that if she would be healthy. But most of all, I worried just about her own little spirits. I wanted her to know that she was loved and wasn't a replacement for her sister. I wanted her to know that she was just loved and cherished and wanted for holy her. But I wanted to be the mom she needed me to be, and not just the mom who was still so heartbroken and heartsick over losing her sister. And so I so worried and stressed about her birth. And I even anticipated lots and lots of emotions upon actually meeting her. And when she was born, it was just pure joy. It was just 100% joy. And I was even shocked and surprised at just the fullness of joy. So my fiery, tenacious, sometimes demanding little girl, Rosie, is my full joy. But also getting outside, clearly. Gardening. Rosie and I have been hiking a lot during COVID because just being outside in nature and living Wendell Berry's poem, The Peace of Wild Things, is just bringing me so much joy.
And your Rosie is the most phenomenal, with the best spirit of joy and love and fierce energy in the world, and is amazing. And you are exactly the mom she needs, and are a phenomenal mom to both of your girls. What a gift. I can't imagine a better mom for either of them in this place.
Yeah. Yeah. I have found that foot stomping mad is a genetic thing.
I love it.
Yes. Yes. And so I still stomp my foot when I'm mad, and so does Rosie. Yeah.
And I've seen others on here. Rebecca just shared on Facebook, her granddaughters are her happy place. I think that's where we find, even after death, the life that comes is where we can find that joy. And what a gift.
Yeah.
What word of encouragement do you have for us today, those of us gathered and for the church?
I think my word of encouragement is to embrace your hurts. Maybe it's because I have a 4-year-old who loves Frozen, but Frozen 2, the song "The Next Right Thing" is
so good.
It's so good. Oh my gosh, I feel like we could just play that and that could be a sermon.
Frozen 2 is, yeah, it's a lot of gospel in there.
On grief, just it's perfect. And so what I want to say is, you know, we've all experienced some griefs and some sadnesses, and they're all interconnected. And so if you're facing a really, really hard thing, pause and look back on another time that you have faced a hard thing, because the wisdom and the insight and the resilience and the grace and the empathy and compassion that you developed from that point, those are the tools needed for the next thing. And so, no, it's not that this test prepared you for what was to come, but you already have the tools and the people and the community around you to go into that hard thing. And so your grief makes you brave.
Yeah. Love that. Your grief makes you brave.
Mm-hmm.
It teaches us how to do the next right thing. What good word of encouragement for us. Do the next right thing. Be honest about our hurt.
Yeah.
Be honest about what's happening.
Yeah.
That's really powerful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Last question, you answered a little bit, but in addition to being outside and your amazing Rosie, what's bringing you life these days in tie-dye?
And tie-dye. Yes. I will come and teach tie-dye to anyone who wants me to. Yes. I mean, finding ways to connect. I am like the most extroverted of extroverts. And so, you know, finding ways to connect with, you know, people like you, Allison and Spencer, every day, what those little things are. But also, because I'm an extrovert, finding ways to connect with myself that isn't natural to me, but it's so worthwhile. And I am a better version of myself when I make space for myself and whatever those emotions are, whether they're grief or joy or whatever it is. Yes. And nightly bowls of popcorn and a glass of wine.
Those are excellent as well.
Yes. Yes.
Thanks for sharing with us tonight, Robyn. Thank you for your wisdom, the way that you have experienced not the way you've experienced grief, but you've experienced your grief, the way you have been intentional about learning from it, living in it, sharing it, so it can make all of us wiser and help move all of us more towards compassion and towards love and towards healing. That honesty and that vulnerability and that bearing witness is hard, and it's a gift. And so thank you for sharing that gift with us, because it helps all of us as we grow and heal, both those of us gathered here where we are tonight, but also those of us gathered as the church, as the faith community. So thank you for that. You are a great teacher in our faith, and I really appreciate your wisdom and your friendship as well. Thank you to all of you who have gathered with us tonight. I hope you know how loved you are, and that we're never alone, that God meets us in every time.
Amen.
Amen. Bye, everybody. Bye, Robyn. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thanks for having me. Thank you,
Always.
folks and Wakanda folks, and even some Crestwood folks. Yay!
We're from at least 3 different states. I think even more on here.
I know, that's exciting. I haven't looked at Facebook. What's going on Facebook?
All kinds of people. There's folks. We have Indianapolis, Iowa. We're all over. Fort Worth. People all over. Growing together.
Thank you, everyone, for coming. Yes, be brave. I think that's all I can say.
Bye, everybody.